After getting out of bed, I stood up in the tiny bedroom, which also served as a store and pantry. I walked slowly from my bed, groped in one corner for matches, and lit my tadova, as it was still dark at that hour. With the tadova in my hand, I walked through the curtained door into the next tiny room where my 3 children were sleeping. They were huddled up in one corner on a mat under one blanket. The opposite side of their room served as a kitchen. Most of the families in that slum area lived in those sorts of rooms. I opened the door leading outside and walked out of the house, cradling the frame of the candle to protect it from being blown out by the wind. In that neighborhood, I was not the only one up at that time. There was already a bit of stirring, as most people had to start their various tasks very early. I walked briskly towards the pit latrine to answer nature's call. I opened the door and immediately let out a cry. No, Katonda wange. I stepped out again, calling out to the neighbors in between my wild screams. Doors were flung open as people rushed out, still rubbing sleep out of their eyes. Others were still in the process of dressing up, with women tying their lesos or busutis around themselves, while men were pulling up their shorts. Some children came out into the early morning breeze naked. Everybody was rushing anxiously to see what happened to make me scream like a mad person at that hour. Some thought that I had perhaps come across a dangerous robber as he tried to steal the property, while others, who loved juicy stories, thought that I was screaming because I had caught my husband sneaking behind my back with a neighbor's wife or daughter. However, they were not prepared for the actual cause of this early morning commotion. My face had become sad, and I stopped talking for some time, and then I resumed my screaming. Nobody could have been prepared for these feeble cries coming from the dark depth of the pit latrine. The shock only mesmerized them for a few minutes. Then there was a hullabaloo and bedlam, as people frantically ran back and forth in the semi-darkness, looking for shovels, hose, ropes, and ladders to rescue the baby, while calling out to each other to hurry up. Sweat was dripping from their brows, as half an hour later, the men managed to pull out the unsightly soiled baby. Women were ready with basins of warm water. It was apparent that the baby needed to be quickly rushed to the hospital for a checkup, as it looked very weak. A policeman had already been fetched while the baby was being rescued from the pit, and he escorted the group that took the baby to the hospital. I knew what followed. I was left at the hospital. The story had first burst out when I was 16 years old and in senior 3 at a boarding school near Mukono. Up to that time, neither my foster parents nor anybody else had ever breathed a word about the nature of my birth. I had always thought that Mr. and Mrs. Isaiah Mweru were my real parents. They were so loving and caring that there was never any moment in my life when I would have doubted them at all. If anything, I was always favored as an only boy and their youngest child. They had 2 daughters who were older than me. The eldest was Sophia, and the second one was Sandra. They too did not know that I was not their real brother. So that year, as soon as we came back to school for the 3rd term, I got a shock that crippled me and blew the daylights out of my life. I had this very good friend called Disan Kitty. As I learned later, after I had been bullied, abused, teased, and beaten by my fellow students because of my past, it was during the previous holidays that when Disan was talking casually to his mother in the presence of 2 visitors, he had mentioned that one of his new friends was called Musa Baraba. Musa Baraba, Mrs. Kate Kitty had inquired from her son, a look of surprise on her face. Disan had repeated the name for her. Do you know his parents? She had asked. Mr. and Mrs. Mweru, Disan had answered simply. My God, you mean that boy survived? Survived what? Robina, one of the visitors, had inquired. Mrs. Kitty had first kept quiet, looking at her son, then at the visitors. Then she had said, would you believe it if I told you I was the one who named that boy Musa Baraba? You? How? Disan had asked. Her 2 visitors had not said anything, but had stared at her questioningly. Well, it's a long story, and a sad one too. I remember I had just started my nursing career when some people brought in a baby boy very early one morning. They said they had just recovered him from a pit latrine. Mommy, what? Dyson had screamed with shock. Oh no, Robina and Aunt Sissy cried in unison. How terrible. Yes, it was terrible, Mrs. Kitty had continued. Even after treatment, the boy was so weak that the nun who was in charge of the hospital had decided we should have him baptized just in case he did not survive. At least he should go as a Christian. So she asked me to choose a name. That is why I chose Musa, because, as you know, Musa in the Bible was rescued from the riverbank, eh? But amazingly, the boy pulled through, and we kept him at the hospital until we got a good home for him. Mr. and Mrs. Meru had approached the hospital authorities. They wanted a baby boy for adoption. They had 2 daughters already, and for some reason, Mrs. Meru had been advised not to have any more children. And since they wanted a boy so much, they decided to adopt one. And they thought Baraba was the most suitable for them, so they took him. And since that time, I had never heard of him again, until now. The cat was out of the bag, and Dyson did not waste time before spreading the story. Within 2 weeks after the beginning of the term, I was puzzled because nobody, friends and enemies alike, wanted to associate with me. I had been such a clever student, and a popular one too. I think my enemies exploited this chance to the maximum. I would never have imagined that young people could be so cruel until that Monday morning when I entered the class.